My name is Matt Romano. I'm coming to you from a rainy Atlanta, Georgia today. And today we are going to talk about the foreign exchange market, topic 6.3. So let's look at what that means. The learning objective, first and foremost, looks like a lot of stuff. It's really not. It's all one thing, if that makes any sense. This all goes together. So I'll run through it real quickly, but you'll see as we walk through this that it's one big topic. Define the foreign exchange market, demand for currency, supply of currency. That's like defining any other market. Explain the relationship between exchange rate, quantity of currency demanded. Define the equilibrium exchange rate, and then finally explain how exchange rates adjust to restore equilibrium in the foreign exchange market. So it sounds like a lot, but at this point, here we are in Unit 6, a long time ago, and we're going to go back and review a little bit. Back in Unit 1, you learned the basics of product markets and how they function, how they operate. And that's all we're doing here. We're essentially reviewing that and then applying it to a new market, a market that you maybe have not discussed a little bit. I bet there's some of you out there whose teachers went ahead and talked about the foreign exchange market back in Unit 1 because it's an excellent example of how markets function. So this is simply another application of a concept that you learned all the way back in Unit 1, and we're going to talk about the specifics of that market today. In doing so, we're going to apply skill 4A. Going to be able to draw an accurately labeled graph or visual representing an economic model or market. And we're going to address the following questions. What's a foreign exchange market? Who participates and why? And I think that's fundamental to understanding this market, just addressing and considering who is it and why are they there? And then, of course, how is this illustrated on a graph? And as a reminder, of course, this year, Unit 6 will not appear on this year's exam, but that said, it's still worth learning. And when you jump into intermediate macro, you're going to want to know this stuff. And when you're out there traveling the world and exchanging currencies, you're going to want to know this stuff. First, let's warm up with a little review from yesterday. Conveniently enough, those were exchange rates. And today we're going to be graphing exchange rates. Yesterday, it was purely understanding the concept of an exchange rate. So the AP exam question from 2011 that we're looking at actually looks at it numerically. And that can be tough. It can be a little bit, I don't know, it's not entirely intuitive for everyone to look at the data itself and understand and interpret that. So let's look at this question. And then today we'll be able to translate this in another way, look at how these changes happen on a graph. Assume yesterday the exchange rate between the euro and the Singaporean dollar was 1 euro equals 0.58 Singaporean dollars. Assume today the euro is trading at 1 euro equals 0.60 Singaporean dollars. So before going on to the rest, just process what that means. It means that today, a euro can buy more Singaporean dollars than it could yesterday. It was only 0.58 yesterday. Today, it can purchase 0.6. On the other hand, it takes more Singaporean dollars today to purchase 1 euro than it did yesterday. That's going to help us. How will the change in the exchange rate affect each of the following in Singapore in the short run? Aggregate demand, explain. Level of employment, explain. And those are obviously connected. So for aggregate demand in Singapore will increase. Why is that? The word explain is there. We have to give an explanation, make a causal relationship obvious. The depreciating Singaporean dollar increases Singapore's exports to European countries because the price of those exports in terms of euros decreases. So again, with the euro capable of purchasing more Singaporean dollars, anyone who owns euros can purchase more Singaporean dollars and therefore purchase more goods in Singapore. That's going to boost exports. And we're going to talk more about that in a couple of days. And that's the foundation of it. We need to make that connection with the exports going up. We're going to see aggregate demand increase, obviously. For the level of employment, that's the next step in this progression. Employment in Singapore will increase because Singapore's real GDP increases. It takes more labor to produce more goods and services. So again, the connection between currency valuation, exports, aggregate demand, and then we can make the leap to real GDP and employment and see the changes that occur as a result. We're going to continue talking about that over the next few days, but again, that should become clear. Okay, moving forward, let's do a little bit more review as promised. Let's go all the way back to Unit 1, and let's talk about product markets, because although you've been using them all along, you may not have thought about the basic fundamentals of them for a while. And since we're building a market today, you might want to rethink some of those basic fundamentals. So here we have a basic product market, price and quantity on the axes, supply and demand. And of course, equilibrium price and quantity has been identified. A couple things to point out about graphing this thing. Let's go ahead and make it an actual market, and let's remind ourselves that on the y-axis, that price is listed as dollars per unit. And I point that out not because it's a difficult concept. I know we know that. But if we're operating in the US and this market is in the US, we have to keep in mind that up and down the y-axis, we're dealing with dollars per unit. And this is going to apply in the foreign exchange market as well. And this is going to help you understand the foreign exchange market a little bit better. So as you well know, if the price rises, it takes more dollars to purchase this good, this particular good. Let's go ahead and give it a name. It's apples. Let's say it's a market for apples. Then we can say that the price is listed in dollars per apple. Now, I know we don't always write that out. Some of us do, some of us don't, but it's worth considering, especially as we're going into the foreign exchange market, to simplify what it is we're looking at. So the higher that price is, the more dollars we're paying to purchase one apple. I want you to be able to translate that over to the foreign exchange market when we get there. What causes that equilibrium price to change? Well, we know that. That's going to change because of shifters of demand and supply. So talking about demand first, let's keep in mind always, whatever market we're in, whether it's apples or loanable funds or money or currency valuation in the foreign exchange market, demand takes the perspective of the buyers, whoever's consuming that good, whoever's buying that good. Always think of that first when you think of demand, which explains the inverse or helps explain the inverse relationship between the price of the good and the quantity demanded. What causes that demand curve to shift? This is just one example. There are many ways to state this, obviously, but these are the general shifters of demand for most any market, and it's going to apply in the foreign exchange market as well. Looking at it from the perspective of apples, taste and preference. People decide they like apples more than they used to, or people hear that apples are healthier than they knew. That's going to increase the demand for apples, and that's going to push price and quantity up. Disposable income is at this point in your AP macro career, that's pretty self-explanatory. When people have more money, they're going to spend more money. So we're saying consumers of apples now have a higher disposable income, demand is going to increase. Expected income is going to cause a shift in demand. If we anticipate, if you're an apple buyer and you expect your income to go up in the near future, you're probably going to buy some more apples. Demand's going to increase. Change in expected prices could potentially cause a shift. Now we know a change in the current price won't. That's moving along. But a change in expected prices will cause a shift. So if we expect, think about this in current times here in April 2020. If we expect the price to go up in the near future, demand is going to shift to the right because people want to go out and buy that product before the price goes up. Number of consumers in the market. If there are an increased number of consumers, that could be a geographic thing where more people move into a geographic market. That's going to increase demand for that product. And of course, if people are leaving, that's going to decrease demand. And of course, there's crossover here. Taste and preference can increase the number of consumers in the market. So if all of a sudden everybody decides apples are really good for me and they really taste good, more consumers in the market and demand increases. And then finally, price of related goods. As you well know, let's just say apples and oranges. If orange prices go up and they're relatively more expensive, well, that could potentially increase demand for apples. This is, again, I know this is common knowledge for you. It's a review for you, but it's good to keep this in mind because we want to apply it to a new market today. Supply takes the producer side. So always think like a producer whenever you're on that supply side of a market. Why would they produce more or produce less in any given scenario? In many cases, it comes down to production costs and really ease of production. When it's more expensive to produce or it's more difficult to produce, supply is going to decrease. It's going to shift left. If it's cheaper and easier to produce, supply is going to shift right. And we see some reasons for that here. Production costs could cause that. Business taxes, subsidies, regulations could obviously affect how costly it is to produce a good. Technology is going to affect whether or not it's easier or harder to produce a good. If there's new production technology in a market, then you're going to see increases in supply. Expectations of revenue, expectations of prices could affect decisions in terms of how much manufacturers are going to bring to the market. So that's also a shifter of supply. And of course, just like on the demand side, price of related goods. And in this case, typically complementary or substitute goods in the production of that good. And that's something that is easy to make a mistake on. We forget that it's in production, not consumption. So on the production side, we can also see the price of related goods affect supply. Again, all that's review. We're going to take that and try to apply as much of that as possible in the foreign exchange market as we are understanding disequilibrium. What if we're not at equilibrium? Here we show a market at equilibrium, but we do know that in some cases, surpluses and shortages are going to occur. A surplus is going to occur if price is set greater than equilibrium. And as a result of that price being set greater than equilibrium, we wind up with a quantity supplied that is greater than quantity demanded. Now, why does that happen? First of all, if this price, P, is going to be the going market price, not the equilibrium price, but the price that producers are charging at the market, well, then we're going to see an increase in quantity supplied. They are willing and able to produce more at the higher price. That's the law of supply. But at the same time, the law of demand tells us that they are not going to buy, consumers are not going to buy as many goods at that higher price. It gives us disequilibrium. The quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded. To correct that takes a long run scenario where ultimately prices start to fall, and with the decrease in the price, we work our way back to equilibrium, PE and QE. The opposite of that would be a shortage. A shortage is going to occur when price is less than equilibrium, resulting in a quantity demanded greater than the quantity supplied. This could happen for a lot of different reasons, but for whatever reason it is, the price at the market is less than equilibrium, less than the market would have at equilibrium. Here we are in, again, April of 2020. Could you imagine any products potentially having a shortage? Maybe related to expectations, maybe related to markets not adjusting to prices as quickly as maybe supply or demand had changed in the real world, and you find yourself with a shortage of a particular good as a result of that. What I've always told students is no matter what the literal cause is, what we can always take from a scenario is if there is a shortage, that we know the going price is actually lower than what equilibrium at that time is. In the case of a surplus, again, the opposite is true. If there's a surplus of a good, the going price is greater than equilibrium in that market. Okay. Went on for a while there, but I know that's all review, so I'm going to move on. But make sure we know that information because we want to, again, apply that to the foreign exchange market. Now, the foreign exchange market itself, let's get into the new stuff and talk about what it is you actually need to know about this market. Our curriculum guide tells us that the foreign exchange market really describes this interaction of buyers and sellers exchanging the currency of one country for the currency of another. And to truly understand what that is, we need to really think deeply about when and where does this actually happen and who is actually participating. And a visual I've always liked to share with my students is I like to picture this market as just one massive market, almost like one giant bank that everybody can attend. Everybody in the world has access to. And you go to this giant market, you go to this giant bank, and all you can do there is trade currencies. You can trade dollars for euros, you can trade euros for pounds, you can trade pounds for yen, you can trade yen for ruble, whatever. But that's all you can do there. So you can come there with one currency, you leave with another currency. That's what happens at the foreign exchange market. In a more literal sense, it is the market where currencies are exchanged for one another, as I just said. Yen for ruble, whatever it happens to be, you're trading one currency for another currency. You are buying currencies. It's in this market that exchange rates are determined. So that question we answered at the beginning of this lesson, how the valuation of the euro relative to the Singaporean dollar changed, well, that happened as a result of exchanges that took place in this market. Exchange rates have to be relative, and it's important that we keep this in mind. All exchange rates are going to be paired up. You can't just say that a currency is strong or a currency is weak. If you're talking about the dollar, for example, the US dollar, and you say the US dollar is strong, well, you can't say that. That's an incomplete statement. You've got to compare that relative value to some other currency. You could say the dollar is strong relative to this currency, but it's weak relative to that, or it got stronger relative to this currency or weaker relative to that one. But it can't do it in and of itself. It doesn't work that way. So exchange rates are paired. We have to have them together. And what we're typically going to do is, in order to show this as clearly as possible, actually draw two graphs. A graph of one currency, maybe the dollar, and a second currency, maybe the euro, and we can compare the two and how their relative values fluctuate with one another. And something that you took from yesterday is that those exchange rates, because they're relative values, they cannot move in the same direction at the same time. So if it is dollar versus euro and the dollar is getting stronger relative to the euro, then the euro must be getting weaker. And we're going to see this when we do some examples. And it's something you've got to keep in mind when you go back and check your work after drawing these types of graphs. In some cases, we may just draw the market for one particular currency, and that's okay, and if that's what's being analyzed. But even then, we're going to make a reference to a second currency so that we can, again, understand that exchange rates are paired, and any value is a relative value compared to a separate currency. Now, quick disclaimer. If you turn this video off and you go watch financial news and they do make a statement such as the dollar is getting stronger today and they leave it at that, they don't pair it up, that is okay. It typically in those scenarios, what they're doing is comparing the dollar to a currency board or a currency index. Think back again. This is knowledge you already have. Think back to a price index back in unit 2. Currency index is like a price index. So you can bundle some currencies that the dollar is typically traded with, bundle them up into a price index, and then compare the value of the dollar to that index. That's typically what they're doing in those shows. That's not what we do in AP Macro. We like to go 1-to-1. How much is $1 worth relative to £1? How much is a euro worth relative to a yen? Whatever it happens to be. So we're going to pair them up individually. So that's the market. That's what the market is and what the market tells us. But again, who's doing this? Who is trading these currencies? And maybe more importantly, why are they trading currencies? Why are individuals participating in the foreign exchange market? So who participates in the market and why? There are many, many, many reasons for this. I like to boil it down to 2 that are maybe almost all encompassing. And I think this will help you as you try to wrap your head around and comprehend what exactly this market is. The first, people trade currency so they can buy things in another country. If I'm in the US, if I'm going to travel to Canada and I want to buy Canadian goods, well, I've got to pay for those goods with Canadian dollars. So in order to buy those goods, I've got to trade my US dollars for Canadian dollars. I'm participating in the foreign exchange market. So if I want to purchase goods and services from another country, I need to purchase the currency of that country before I can do so. The other would be purchasing financial assets. That could be securities, it could be currency, it could be all kinds of financial assets from another country. And again, to do that requires purchasing of the currency first. And again, why do people do this? They're looking to earn income from, again, foreign assets. So we need to consider that when we get into supply and demand and the reasons why exchange rates may change and reasons why we see fluctuations on foreign exchange markets. So keep that in mind. Who's actually participating and why are they participating? They want to buy goods and services. They want to buy financial assets. That's why. And they're willing to give up their own currencies so that they can buy those assets or they can buy those goods and services. Again, keep in mind, currency is a financial asset. There are individuals that'll trade currencies just like someone else may be trading stocks on the stock market, hoping that the value of that currency is going to go up over time and they're going to earn income as a result. Okay, again, that's kind of a guideline. We've got one more step and then we can jump right into this market. What are the actual determinants of flexible exchange rates? Well, first and foremost, those shifters of supply and demand still apply. As I said at the start, it's just another market like any other product market, but some are more applicable than others, and it's helpful to point those out. One word about the statement here, determinants of flexible exchange rates. We are going under the assumption here that we're studying flexible exchange rate regimes as opposed to fixed exchange rate regimes. We're not studying fixed exchange rates here. That's something that would take place within an economy as a result of central bank or government policy, and we're not going to go there. What we are assuming here is that exchange rates are flexible, meaning that markets, the buyers and sellers themselves, are actually determining the fluctuations in supply and demand, and as a result, exchange rates are going to fluctuate with those changes in supply and demand. So what determines why supply and demand change? Again, keeping in mind those basic primary supply and demand shifters, you could put them into these categories as well to be more specific to the exchange rates that we see in the foreign exchange market. So number one, international trade, as I just said. And among those, change in taste and preferences. If goods from a particular part of the world, a particular country, become more popular internationally, well, then we can conclude demand for that currency is also going to increase in demand. That's pretty self-explanatory. I don't think that really needs a lot of extra explanation. You probably get that pretty easily. The second one, however, is sometimes a challenge for students that see this for the first time. Relative interest rate changes. We point this one out because it occurs enough that we want to be aware of it, that whether it's central bank policy or changes in the money market due to money demand or anything else, when there's an overall change in interest rates, we tend to see a correlating change in currency values as a result. And the reason would be foreign investors that are seeking high returns. And that interest rate change, that rising interest rate or falling interest rate, indicates a higher potential return in that nation. So again, I'm here in the US. If I see that securities coming out of somewhere in Europe are going to be higher than they are here in the US, well, maybe I want to get that high return. I want to get that high interest rate. I'm going to purchase securities from that entity in Europe. I need euros to do so. So the increase in interest rates is going to drive increases in demand for that particular currency. That's what that means. So again, it comes down to returns, and returns investors want when they're looking internationally at different assets they could purchase. Finally, relative income economic conditions. A lot of different economic conditions. I've just listed a few that are going to influence trade and therefore influence currency valuations through the foreign exchange market. For example, relative income changes. Let's go back to Canada and the US. That's a good example because there's so much trade and such convenient avenues for trade between those two neighbors. Let's just say, if national income in Canada were rising, let's say the economy were very strong, unemployment's low, incomes are going up, people in Canada are going to buy more goods. We know that. We know that domestically. They're going to buy more goods internationally as well. And because a trade relationship exists with the US, and because that trade is relatively easy and convenient, we can anticipate more purchase of US goods, an increase in US exports. But to do that, they're going to have to exchange Canadian dollars for US dollars. So that relative income change is going to lead to an increase in demand for the US dollar. The same is true for relative inflation rates, or even price levels in general, but inflation in particular. What if, again, Canada and the US, what if you have just really high inflation in Canada and prices are stable in the US? Well, put yourself in that position. If you're in Canada, if you're on the border and you have the opportunity to buy goods in either nation, you would rather buy goods where inflation is lower, where prices aren't rising so rapidly. So given that opportunity from a trade relationship, if inflation is high, again, in Canada, you're going to see an increase in demand for US dollars because they'd rather buy goods where prices aren't rising so rapidly. And then finally, really repetitive with what we've already talked about, but expectations of any of this can have an impact on foreign exchange markets. Essentially, if investors who are considering purchasing a particular currency anticipate the value of that currency going up because of these reasons, future income, future price changes, interest rates, exchange rates, whatever, they're going to buy more of that now, just like you would in the earlier example if you expected the price of apples to go up. You don't want to wait for the price to go up. You want to buy it now. So if you expect the price to go up, buy more now, demand increases. Okay. That's all foundational. Now let's build the model. We want to build the model so we can use the model and therefore make conclusions about changes in exchange rates. So building the model, I like to start with demand. I just think it's more relatable in most cases. We've all been buyers of goods. So talking about demand for foreign exchange, demand for a currency. In this case, we're going to look at the foreign exchange market for euros, and we're comparing euros to the dollar. So on the x-axis, we have quantity of euros. We have a downward sloping demand curve. The law of demand still applies here. And then on the y-axis, I want us to take a good look here at the y-axis and how that's been notated. It says dollars per euro. What we're showing here is the price of a euro in dollars. And what I want to illustrate for you is that although this can seem a little odd, a little different, and sometimes students have a hard time remembering this, there are two things I want you to remember. First things first, we're writing this out as a ratio, we're writing it as a fraction. Just a simple mnemonic device for you, so you don't do this inaccurately, so you're correct every time. In this ratio, in this fraction, the denominator on the bottom always corresponds with what you have down here on the x-axis on the bottom. So what goes on the bottom is what's on the bottom. Now, that doesn't teach you why, but it does help you remember so that you're drawing it correctly and you're labeling it correctly, because we know in order to communicate correctly, we have to label things correctly. Why is that? Well, back up again. In the product market, we showed the market for apples, and we said on the y-axis, we are always showing the price in dollars per unit. In that case, it was dollars per apple, how many dollars it takes to purchase one apple. We're doing the same thing here, but instead of buying apples, we're buying euros. So on the y-axis, what we're showing would be the price of a euro in dollars, how many dollars it takes to purchase 1 euro. And moving up and down that y-axis is going to tell me something about the appreciating or depreciating value of a euro in dollars. If the value goes up, it takes more dollars to buy 1 euro. the euro is more expensive, it is appreciated. If we're moving down the y-axis, it takes less dollars to purchase 1 euro, it is depreciating. As far as demand itself is concerned, again, you've got to ask yourself, why would people be buying euros? Well, primarily because they want to buy goods or financial assets, goods and services or financial assets from Europe. And if they want to buy more of them for some reason, demand is going to shift to the right. If they want to buy less, if people have decided they don't like European goods anymore, you're going to see demand shift to the left. Keep it that simple. As for supply, who are the suppliers in this case of euros? Well, it's people with euros who in this case are exchanging them for dollars. Keep that in mind every time you draw supply and every time you think about manipulating supply. Why would people be exchanging euros for dollars? Well, if they need dollars, they have to come to that foreign exchange market and give up their euros, and that's going to have an impact on the supply of euros. And we're going to look at that in just a moment to see how that works. So we have the supply, we have the demand, we know how to draw the graph. And obviously, as you well know, in any product market, we're going to put those on there together. And when we do, we can easily identify our equilibrium exchange rate. That's what the little e is for, and our equilibrium quantity of euros on the market. No changes here. This is, again, like any other product market you've ever worked with. It's just a little more unique in terms of the application of your supply and demand shifters, and a little bit broader in terms of the scope that we're dealing with. Finally, worth addressing, surpluses and shortages can happen here as well, and the same rules apply. So disequilibrium does occur when the going exchange rate is not equal to the market exchange rate. So if we have a situation where the going exchange rate E1 is greater than the market exchange rate, we're going to have a surplus. We can measure that surplus as the quantity supplied minus the quantity demanded. Likewise, if our going exchange rate E1 is less than the market exchange rate of E, we're going to have a shortage. And that shortage is going to be measured by QD minus QS. In both cases, these surpluses and shortages, the disequilibrium, it can correct itself as equilibrium adjusts back to, I'm sorry, as exchange rates adjust back to equilibrium. Okay, so those are the basics. Those are the fundamentals of the foreign exchange market. Let's do a couple questions here just to get a little practice and see how this works. And in these examples, we're going to do two graphs, which again is very typical for analysis in AP Macro, where we can compare the overall valuations of one currency to the valuation of another currency when a particular transaction or event has occurred. So let's start where we were just now. We're going to compare the dollar and the euro. So on the left, we have the market for dollars on the foreign exchange market as compared to euros. And on the right, we have the market for euros compared to dollars. Now, it appears if the exchange rate's equal, that's unintentional. It's just how I happen to draw it in this particular case. So don't read anything into that. Do pay attention to the labeling. On the x-axis, we have whichever currency we're talking about. So again, over here on the left, we have the dollar market, and we're purchasing dollars in euros. And over here, we have the market for euros purchased in dollars. All right, we've got our graphs. Now let's deal with the situation. Let's say that airlines lower fares. So throughout the US, airline fares are going down. And as a result, you have many Americans who decide they're going to go on vacation to Europe because it's now cheaper and they're able to afford that. What's going to happen as a result? Well, what I like to ask first is, if this were to happen, let's take the buyer perspective. Which currency are people going to want or need as a result of this? In this case, people are going to Europe. They need euros because while you're in Europe, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to eat. You're going to buy some stuff. You need that kind of money so that you can do those things. So you've got to get some euros. That means you're going to have an increase in the demand for euros. In order to get the euros that you're going to use on your trip, you have to supply dollars to the foreign exchange market. You're coming with your dollars. You're coming to this foreign exchange market saying, here, take my dollars. I don't need them anymore. You take them. Those dollars weren't on the foreign exchange market initially, but now they are. That causes an increase in the supply of dollars, and then you're demanding euros at that market. So demand for euros will increase. We go from D to D1, causing the exchange rate to rise, the quantity of the market to also rise. And at the same time, there's going to be an increase in the supply of dollars on the foreign exchange market, causing the exchange rate to fall. How do we interpret that? On the left, the exchange rate falling for the dollar means that the dollar is depreciating relative to the euro. And on the right, With exchange rates rising, it takes more dollars to purchase 1 euro. The euro appreciates relative to the dollar. Again, remind yourself, if you do questions like this, you want to go back and check your work. One thing you can always check, it is impossible in this type of a scenario for both currencies to go up in value or both currencies to go down. They are relative values. When one goes up, the other must go down. So check yourself there. And if you find that both currencies appreciated, you did something wrong. So go back and rework the question. You've got to have one appreciate, one depreciate. Appreciate means go up in value, depreciate, go down in value. So dollar depreciates and the euro appreciates in this example. Let's do another one. All right, we've drawn now a graph of the Canadian dollar versus the peso, the Mexican peso. There are a number of dollars, there are a number of pesos out there in the world, so you have to specify which is which. Mexico and Canada are trade partners. Let's now assume that national income in Mexico rises. Again, this is ceteris paribus. The only thing we know is that national income in Mexico rises. As a result, because we know that there's already an established trade relationship here, if households in Mexico have higher incomes, they're going to buy more goods, and some of those goods are going to be Canadian goods. But in order to purchase those Canadian goods, they're going to have to purchase Canadian dollars first. So which currency is in greater demand? Obviously the Canadian dollar. In order to get those dollars, you have to exchange pesos. So we should see an increase in demand for Canadian dollars and an increase in the supply of pesos. As a result of that exchange, we're going to see a depreciated peso, and we're going to see appreciation of the Canadian dollar. Again, all of that based upon an increase in national income in Mexico. A couple more. All right. Now we're going to look at trade relationship or foreign exchange market relationship between the UK and Japan. So we have the pound, the British pound, and the Japanese yen. And in this example, let's assume that interest rates in the UK are unchanged, but at the same time, there's been an increase in the demand for money in Japan. What can we take from this? Okay, so we're talking interest rate changes. We've got to think in terms of returns or expected returns on financial assets. There's been no change in the UK. You get the same interest rate you would have gotten yesterday. But if there's increasing demand for money in Japan, visualize that graph. We've got money supply and money demand. Money demand goes up. Interest rates in Japan are going to go up. That's a signal that you can get a higher rate of return for financial assets in Japan. So if you're sitting in the UK and you want to invest your money, put your money into an asset that's going to get you a better return, Japanese financial assets look like a pretty good deal at this point. In order to purchase those financial assets, you need yen. So you have to exchange your pounds for yen, increasing demand for yen, increasing supply for pounds. And the result's going to be an appreciated yen and a depreciated pound. And again, this goes back to what we said a few slides ago. Relative interest rate changes will cause changes on the foreign exchange market. Money is going to chase after those higher interest rates. That's an easy phrase to remember, and it's generally going to be true because people are looking to get those higher returns on financial assets. One more, and I think we've got it. All right, in this case, we're going to compare the Korean won to the Australian dollar. South Korea and Australia are trade partners. And let's assume in this case that inflation in Australia increases. Again, we take a ceteris paribus perspective, so we assume nothing else has changed, no changes in Korea. If this is the case, where would you like to purchase goods? Well, I'd rather go where the inflation isn't so high. So that increase in inflation in Australia is going to lead people to want to purchase goods in Korea. That's going to increase demand for the Korean won. You're going to see an increase in the supply of Australian dollars as you're exchanging dollars for won. And as a result of those two changes, the Australian dollar would depreciate, the Korean won would appreciate. So that's 4 examples just to give you a sense of how this works and how we can apply those shifters. A few things, again, to keep in mind. Keep that ceteris paribus condition in mind. With the foreign exchange market and international trade, so much going on, it's easy to think of too many different variables at once. Focus on one at a time, hold everything else constant and see what happens. Keep in mind when you go back and look at your work, one currency is going to appreciate, the other one's going to depreciate. How we get there varies, depends on the scenario, but that will always be true. You can't have both currencies appreciate at one time, not relative to one another. That just cannot happen in these markets. Finally, what did we do today? Again, there was a lot here, but as I said at the start, it all goes together. It all is part of one big puzzle. And hopefully in going through this lesson, it makes sense as to why I said that. And ultimately, as I'm sure many of your teachers have already told you, it's just a new application of product markets that you learned all the way back in Unit 1. And again, I'm sure many of you did that already in Unit 1. I have many good friends who teach this subject that way. It's another application of supply and demand. So as long as we know supply and demand well and we've retained that knowledge, we can apply that knowledge, we're good to go with the foreign exchange market. One last reminder that, of course, when you're preparing for the exam this year, that won't be there. When you're preparing for intermediate macro next year, it'll be there. I'm going to leave you with some practice. I'm going to go back to a question that we've already asked. Question 3 from 2014. We did parts A and B earlier when we're talking about the balance of payments and how that's going to change over time. So I went ahead and put that up there with the answers just as a reminder of what we've already done, but then tacked on part C. We did not talk about part C. So for tomorrow's lesson, go ahead and finish off part C. Remind yourself about parts A and B and how those worked and what the correct answers were. And then complete part C as a way of practicing what we talked about today with the foreign exchange market. Again, a reminder, as we are approaching those exams, if you're worried about the technology needs or of you or a friend or anyone that you happen to know, please contact collegeboardcb.org/tech. And of course, we'll work to help you out there and make sure that you're able to show what you have learned and to do your best. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you got something out of this, and I hope you have a great day. Be well.